Okay, so we are going to begin our keynote with Kiki Petrosino, and I am going to just really contain myself because she's a poet I love and admire, and I'm really excited. So welcome to our keynote session with Kiki Petrosino for the 2021 Kentucky State Poetry Society's annual conference. You are in the right place, and we are glad to have you join us this evening. We deeply appreciate Kiki Petrosino being able to join us. And though she has now moved away from Kentucky, our poetry community is in debt to the teaching and writing she shared during her Kentucky years. We hope to have time for questions at the end of the reading. If you would like to post a question, it will need to go in the Q&A that's at the bottom of the screen and not into the chat. Let us begin. Kiki Petrosino is a poet I have long admired, and she was one of the first Saraband poets that I met when my own book was accepted. So she was the first poet of the press, and that made a big impression on me. It's my honor to introduce her this evening. Kiki Petrosino is the author of White Blood, a Lyric of Virginia, which is a beautiful and important book, and you need to go to the book fair and buy it, and 3 other poetry books. She holds graduate degrees from the University of Chicago and the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Her poems and essays have appeared in Prairie Schooner, Best American Poetry, The Nation, The New York Times, Fence, Gulf Coast, Jubilat, Tin House, and online at Plowshares. She directs the creative writing program at the University of Virginia, where she is a professor of poetry. Petrosino is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, a fellowship in creative writing from the National Endowment for the Arts, and an Al Smith Fellowship from the Kentucky Arts Council and the UNT Rilke Prize. Please welcome Kiki Petrosino.
Well, thank you so much, Amelia. Thank you, everybody from the Kentucky State Poetry Society. It's really wonderful to be back online with you and to reconnect with Kentucky, with a place that continues to mean a whole lot to me, and where I learned so much about what it means to teach and write, especially to teach and write about place, which has always been important to me as a poet. But it was not really until I got to Kentucky that I really could feel what it meant to be part of a community that links itself so strongly to place. And it was because of the time that I spent in Louisville that I really decided that I wanted to write a book that was about place as well. So some of the poems that I'll share tonight from my latest book, White Blood, a Lyric of Virginia, also pertain to Kentucky and to some parts of my time there. So I'll read some poems, and then I am happy to answer questions. I'll start from the beginning. Prelude. You're on a train, and your ancestors are in the quiet car. The quiet car is locked with a password you can't decrypt. You're a professional password decryptor, but your ancestors are demolition experts. They're wearing black tactical gear, and your ancestors are wearing black tactical gear. You're dashing through each compartment, slamming doors open while your ancestors lay small explosives. As the heat expands within the carriage, you escape through a picture window. You climb to the top of the train and your ancestors rappel down the sides. You're rappelling down one side of the train when you glimpse your ancestors above you. They leap from carriage to carriage as if weightless, as if drifting, as if curling tongues of snow. You cling to the side of the train as each of your ancestors lifts away from you. They float into the cloud of themselves. In the rushing light, you perceive them as hundreds of slow snake doctors. Oh, you begin. What your results mean. Western Africa, 28%. The West African you is a hunter. Try. Carry this. The West African U has split and expanded, a mixture historic as a gene. The West African component of your lineage, the out of Africa event, the New World slave seen in this genetic print. You are likely a mixture, a cluster, a high number. Your DNA has roots that cluster and spread and trade and carry. The West African U spanning more than more regions of time in people. Oh, between this cluster and this cluster, an African O, Niger and Chad, O fingerprint. African U span most of Africa, African America, African diaspora, and the southern African forests out of Africa, east, south, and then southeast, within Africa, throughout Africa, the historic African world. Well, so, well, so. So that last poem, What Your Results Mean, is part of a trio of poems that I wrote using the same form, using the same formal approach. Every poem in the book that starts out what your results mean and then gives you a percentage of a geographic region is what's called an erasure poem, meaning that I took an existing text. In this case, I took a little part of the explanatory paragraph that I got after I took my DNA test. And I erased certain words so that I could make a poem out of the remaining words. So each section of the Western Africa 28% poem comes from that portion of my DNA test. And it actually consists of 10 erasures of the exact same paragraph. So I took that one little paragraph, I erased it 10 times to create 10 little mini poems that I put together in that piece. And so there are 3 of those in the book, each one representing a different region. I'm going to move now to a part of the book that deals with the place in Virginia where I am broadcasting from, Central Virginia. I'm broadcasting here from Orange County, Virginia, from the town of Orange, which is in like the middle of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Right next door is Albemarle County, and that's where the University of Virginia is. That's where I work. And that, of course, is where Monticello is, Thomas Jefferson's famous home on the mountain. These poems are all from a section called Albemarle. Instructions for time travel. You must go through Mr. Jefferson, along his row of Chinaberry trees, behind the ruined smokehouse, in unmarked tracts, under field stones, with no carvings, no monuments, with a few leaves shadowing the mulch, near scattered weeds in sunken lines, while the sun walks in the day at the end of the day, in an oval of brushed earth, just as the soft path finishes under branches where the dead are always saying what they always say, right about me. Monticello House Tour. What they never say is Mr. Jefferson's still building. He's just using clear bricks now for his turrets and halls, for the balconies rounding his palace in transparent loops of dug air. After death, it's so easy to work. No one sees him go out from the residence, his gloves full of quiet mortar. Mr. Jefferson's coat is narrow as daybreak. His long sleeves drag in the muck as he minces his turf. You know the room you were born in? It's part of the tour. Hundreds of rooms unfolding for miles, orchards alive in the parlor. Remember that gold chair you loved, the one with a face like a lion, especially in late winter when mother sat with you in her pink gown humming? As it happens, Mr. Jefferson built you that lion. He drew your time in prudent proportions. You have one job, to fit the design he keeps spinning. Your whole life is laced through a ring of similar finds. Look, It's all mothers in pink gowns humming. Essay in architecture. The human face, its pine doors painted like mahogany. Human face with horses under each veranda. Perfect parquet tetragons of the human face. Human face still legible in Old French. Sealed closet of the human face lit by oculus. Design face, tinker face, factory face. Twine and bare wood comprising a pulley system for the human face. Woodworked face with sunbeams settling in. Revolving buffet supporting the human face. Entire pewter plate collection in the face. Human face as soup tureen, as paint chip, as spit jack. Smoke rings textured like the human face. Human face cured, human face pickled, human face brushed with olive oil, anchovies, and parmesan. Green floor of the dome room just above the human face. Floating view of the face, its quarter farms, rough cabins dotting a sloped face partly visible. Human face built to resemble a great clock, great pendulum drawing faces in the air. So as you can probably hear, a bunch of those poems in the Albemarle section are inspired by several trips that I took to have kind of the touristic experience of Monticello, to go and take the tours and to look at the gardens, to listen to people talking about the kinds of trees that were planted. Mr. Jefferson, of course, is still very much a phantom, but also a real presence in this part of Virginia. And when I was going to the University of Virginia as a student, he was referred to as Mr. Jefferson, and sometimes irreverently as TJ. And so I put Mr. Jefferson, he seemed to want to be Mr. Jefferson in the poems that I was writing. Essay in architecture is a phrase that Jefferson himself used to describe Monticello itself. He called it his essay, his try, his attempt, an essay in architecture. Terrorum. Every night I go back to Mr. Jefferson's place, searching still, his kitchens behind staircases in a patch of shade somewhere, beside his joinery and within his small ice house, till I get down that pit lined with straw where Mr. Jefferson once stacked frozen slabs of river water until summer. Then visitors would come to him to ask about a peculiar green star or help him open up his maps. They'd kneel together on the floor among his books, lavish hunks of ice melting like the preserved tears of some antique mammal who must have wept to leave Albemarle, just as I wept when I landed in Milan for the first time, Stone City, where Mr. Jefferson began to learn the science of ice houses, how you dig into the dark flank of the land, how you seal the cavity. Leave open just one small hatch through which I might lift through gratings Mr. Jefferson's cold-dressed victuals, his expensive butter and salads, the sealed jars sweating clear gems of condensation, white blood appearing from warm air, as if air could break and slough, revealing the curved arc of our shared Milan. There, I wore silver rings on each thumb. I studied and spoke in fine houses of ice. I knew a kind of crying which sealed me to such realms for good. Old magic weep, old throb in throat. How much of my fondness for any place is water, stilled and bound to darkness. Here's a poem that touches a little bit on my time teaching at the University of Louisville, which was an amazing experience. 9.5 years, 9.5 years that I got to spend in the city of Louisville teaching students. Farm book. Whenever I write about Mr. Jefferson, he gallops over. Knock, knock, he begins in quadruplicate. It's pretty wild. Like my student's poem about a house of skin and hair, a house that bleeds. Mr. Jefferson's place is so dear to me, white husk my heart beats through until I can't write more. In my student's poem, the house stands for womanhood, pain coiled in the drywall. Sorrow warps the planks, pulling nails from ribs. In Kentucky, I'm the only Black teacher some of my students have ever met, and that pulls me somewhere. I think of Mr. Jefferson sending his field slaves to the ground, a phrase for how he made them pull tobacco and hominy from the earth, but also for how he made of the earth an oubliette. At 16, they went to the ground. If Mr. Jefferson thought they couldn't learn to make nails or spin, he forgot about them until they grew into cash or more land. For him, it must have seemed like spinning. Sorrow of souls forced to the ground as a way of marking off a plot. At 16, I couldn't describe the route to my own home, couldn't pilot a vehicle, could hardly tell the hour on an analog clock. I had to wear my house key on a red loop around my neck. Now I rush to class beneath a bronze Confederate, his dark obelisk, his silent mustache. My books tumble past the lectern as I recite Mr. Jefferson's litany, swan, loon, nuthatch, kingfisher, electric web of names, yet in the ground I know a deeper weave of gone away ones who should mean more to me than any book. I live in language on land they left. I have no language to describe this. What your results mean. Northwestern Europe, 12%. This region, early episodic habit, region divided into small percentages of centuries. It is a long advent, we now know. Region of rope, much more than a region, the spread of this in small ages. Avian man migrating south and east over the last Latin centuries. This region of composite character grew from mix and tick. Ion subdivided into empire. Much more than an historical population, it is the South, ethnic, political, so small. This region, a graphical character. Settler, farmer, biographical region of one. This region of glaciation, spread of settlers, the last people of European ancestry, from that we part. Region migrating from region. I'll read a couple of poems from a section of the book called Louisa, which is another county in central Virginia. It is right next door to Orange County. It is also adjacent right next door to Albemarle County. So these three counties are touching each other, and I passed through each one of them on my way to UVA to teach, and then back home to my home in Orange. Louisa is where my grandmother's family basically all hail from. She was born in Washington, D.C. during a brief time that my great-grandparents were living there and trying to live in the city. But pretty soon they returned to the country. They returned to Louisa, where my great-grandfather was a farmer, and he built a home for the family. So Louisa is an old place. And like many of these counties in Virginia, it has records going back to the era of enslavement. And some of these records are kept at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. And so I went there and looked at some of the records that had to do with that era, specifically about Louisa. So here's a couple poems about that. A Guide to the Louisa County Free Negro and Slave Records, 1770 to 1865. The first box is for all the good white men, the ones who freed their slaves on Christmas. It's always Christmas in the first box, the day Delpha shall go out, the day Viney shall go out. These good white men only desire the guardian care of those under age. After that, they shall go out, just as Winnie shall go out at the age of 21, entirely free from me or mine or any other person whatsoever. Delpha, Viney, and Winnie shall go out on Christmas Day. The first box slides open to show their certificates. The good white men of this county, believing that all men are by nature equally free, have left many of these. One certificate is for Viney, one for Winnie, one for Delpha. But these good white men can only free the slaves they truly own. One man observes, the above-mentioned Negroes are disputed in their titles to me, namely Delpha, Viney, and Winnie. He doesn't say more about the dispute. He doesn't say what happens on Christmas Day. This good white man has said all three should go out precisely on Christmas Day, but now it is different. It is very different now, even though Christmas has come. The good white man writes, I only free as to my right and title given under my hand. The box slides open to show certificate after certificate. It's Christmas. Louisa County Patrol Claims, 1770 to 1863. I pry open the files, still packed with liquor and strange brine. Midnight seeps from the cracks, slow pulp of arithmetic. 4 or 5 or 6 at a time, the white men draw along the Gordonsville Road on foot or on horseback, clustered close, each man counting up his hours, the knife of each man's tongue at the hinge of his own mouth. For 93 years, and every time I slip away to read, those white men line the roadway, secreting themselves in the night air, feeding and breathing in their private column. Why belly up to their pay stubs, scraping my teeth on the chipped flat of each page? This dim drink only blights me, but I do it. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. You ask why we didn't register as required, why we failed to appear before the provost marshal, why we avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. You ask where we sheltered while battles seethed, where our mothers gave birth, in which hidden houses, and why we didn't register as required. While so many perished in other counties or raged with Nat in Southampton, how did we manage? We avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. Whatever we had, we held. Whatever we knew, we told no one who counted. We kept back our names. We didn't register as required. When you search for us now, you find silence. You may trace us back to a moment, no further. We avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank with its clock tracking everyone's time but our own. We chose inward passages. We kept deep counsel. We didn't register as required, which disappoints you. Why do you trust the courthouse, the census, the bank? Okay. And I want to leave enough time for questions. So I'm gonna I'll read 2 more poems. And the last one that I read will be specifically for Louisville and for Kentucky. That'll be the last poem. Here's the second to last one. What your results mean, North and East Africa, 5%. For millennia, the Mediterranean Sea was as one, despite the constant movement of people across people. This component traveled across logical connection, remnants all numb. North of the world, the earliest people saw Africa evident in the eye. Place of first migration, mitochondrial flux, the savanna frequency. This component of you includes a great rift, influx of lists. Mediterranean most traveled, Mediterranean biological, old and in pain. The sea saw the south, sea. South, oldest home, wide open, high. South of the great valley and west of Lucy, here the pen. Birthplace as well as departure point. Ocean, this is where historically we from. So the last poem in the book is called Psalm. And I wrote this poem right after the tragic Kroger shooting in Louisville, in which 2 African-American elders were killed by a white supremacist who had come to the Kroger and opened fire. And I was asked by Louisville Magazine to write a poem. And I wanted to write something of a prayer because it seemed like we were just at a big moment of crisis in Louisville around this type of violence. So I wanted to offer something, offer it up in a way. So this poem is called Psalm. Dear Lord, dear high remembrancer, dear providential love, have mercy. Have mercy, thou surveyor of wildflowers, assessor of royal and exquisite bee realms. Have mercy, ledger, who tracks us in the night, who measures without speaking our dark trespasses. For nothing here survives, not the gold-legged deer browsing the bleached office park at dawn, nor the minute finch on her branch of long division, but thou absorb it all. O gazer, be kind in thy absorbing calculus. Won't be long before thy reckoning curve arrives at the junction of our error. How beneath thy mineral eye we walk abroad, forgetting thee, cartographer of sparrows.
Thank you. That was so amazing. And I kept making faces back at you and I was like, wait, she can't see me. That was incredible. And I know that there's applause happening in the virtual sphere around us. Thank you so much. It was so important to hear you read those poems. One thing I do want to say before we get to the questions is that this book is a book that we have needed, and like we've needed it for a long time, but it also feels very timely. But for me, when I read it very quickly. And I read at night. So I was like, oh, I'm just going to read it before I go to bed. And I'll just read a little bit. And then I was reading and reading. And I mean, I had to stop because it was late and I have to go to bed. But I was just pulled so quickly through this book that I finished it. And then I had to go back. I was like drawn back to reread it. I think I'm on my 4th time. So there's something that opens each time I read it, but I was surprised how fast I read it maybe the first 2 times, because so much is happening and it's so dense, and yet those erasures and those erasures appear so light. So I don't know if this is a question so much as just like admiration for how you can create something that is both dense and heavy and the reader can move through it so quickly.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear all of that and to hear like how a reader experiences it. It felt like some of these poems were really hard won. It took research, it took time. I had to think about it. There are some poems that I think I couldn't have written until the point that I did write them. There's a sonnet sequence that I have in the book that talks about some of my experiences as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, and talks about my grandfather's death, which happened while I was an undergraduate. And that was 20 years ago. And I had never written about those things before now, but it felt important suddenly to do it in this book. And I feel like that's maybe true of poetry or of different kinds of art making, that like sometimes you're just not ready and then you become ready and it happens.
Yes, you arrive at it and then it comes through time and you're like, yes, this is the time, and those things intersect. We do have several questions, so I'm going to open up the Q&A and try not to mess this up. Okay, so our first question comes from Marianne Worthington, and she asks, so much of your work is based on historical research and not just in white blood. Could you talk some more about how you make the research a part of the creative process, like using the DNA results to make the erasure poems?
You know, it's something of a process, because I feel like each poem is different, and it's each poem is a different experience to write and to research. So for something like the DNA test, I started just taking a DNA test because I was curious about the actual information that it might reveal, or that it would pretend to reveal. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about writing any poems that were based on that. But when I got my test results, and I am a Black American of interracial ancestry. I have one Black parent and one white parent. One Italian, Italian American parent accounts for the white side, some of the white ancestry that I have. And so my DNA test had like a ton of things, like they give you a map of the world, and they color code the parts of the world that your DNA is from, and the whole map, almost the whole map, really lit up. But I was really curious about the significant amount of Western Africa and Northern Eastern Africa DNA that this test said that I had, and some of the explanations about this component of your DNA developed over time, and people moved from place to place. But also there was a ton of DNA that I have that's from like Western and Central Africa, where, were it not for the slave trade, that those those peoples would have stayed exactly where they are and are still there. So, it was, in order to write that poem, I kind of had to think about what it means to be part of a diaspora, but originally my ancestors were indigenous people. And think about what that meant. So I did a lot of thinking, and then I had to identify what are the forms that could help illuminate some of that thinking. And in the case of the DNA test, I thought that erasure would be good, because in erasing existing text, you're kind of pointing out where gaps and silences in the historical record are. And I wanted in this book to point to the fact that I know where this DNA, where I share DNA with people around the world, but I don't know the stories about how and who my ancestors actually were, who brought that DNA over here, or who were trafficked over here as a result of the slave trade. And so as much as I know, there's equally as much, if not more, that I don't know, and that I don't know if I will ever get to find out. So the form has to serve the thought process.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful to get to hear the idea behind that, because those erasures are so powerful in this book, and they're so poignant in what is missing. I know we have another question about the erasures, so let me get to that. Okay, this one comes, well, John Thurr has two questions. He is our new editor of Pegasus. Okay, so John says, I enjoy your work with erasure poetry, most especially given the subject matter. Can you recommend other works of erasures or poets who work with this approach?
Sure. I would first point you to Ronald Johnson, who in the early 1980s wrote, it's called Radios or Radios, but it's an erasure of the first 4 books of Milton's Paradise Lost. So you can see, like, Paradise Lost, Radios. And so the poems are kind of a radio, right? Taking some kind of an echo from the Milton. So it's a conceptual project, but it's also the approach to erasure that Johnson uses there is similar, right? It's what inspired my particular approach to the erasure. So he takes the poetry from Milton and he erases chunks of it to make his poems, but he leaves the text that exists, that remains. He leaves those words all in their original positions where they were in the original Milton. So you have a text that is full of white space and openings and places and pauses and things like that. And so, that book, I had encountered it as a university student and as a graduate student, but then I had kind of left it behind. And while I was teaching at Louisville, I picked it up again and was like, I think my students would like this. So I taught it and a couple of times, and it taught really, really well. Students enjoyed looking at it and almost looking at each page as if it were a painting or something that you could just encounter visually. So that's like a really cool example of erasure. But you might also look at Mary Ruffle, A Little White Shadow, where she kind of whites out poetry using, I believe it is whiteout, so instead of having white space, she's like painting with whiteout over it. And then the third one that I would give you, I mean, there's many different projects in erasure, but I would also point you to Tom Phillips. That's 2 L's in Phillips. He's a UK-based visual artist, and his book is called A Humament, which is an erasure of a 19th century kind of a penny novel that he had picked up in a flea market that was called A Human Document. So he bought up this book and he took each page. He's really more of a visual artist, and he created a story. He took gouache paint, which is opaque watercolor paint, and he painted over the pages in order to kind of create a story in that way. So each page is really colorful and interesting, and he's done several different erasures or projects of the same pages. So if you go to his website, you'll be able to see some really interesting work there.
Wow. I feel like I can feel the teacher you are coming across in the sharing of information. I was just like, how can I write down all of these notes?
I do ramble on. I do tell
no,
my,
it's so great. It's so great. I was like, I wish I could be in your class. Okay, I'm going to ask John's next question because he actually had 2. His second question, he says it's perhaps a little bit corny or cringy. Thinking back to your early excellent work using Robert Redford and your connection to Virginia, do you have the urge to use Thomas Jefferson in a similar way?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in my first book, I did have this sort of like muse-like figure that was based on a filmic, Redfordish character. And I feel like probably in doing that, I was sort of reaching towards this like mainstream Americanness and this like idea of American masculinity that probably Jefferson is one of the progenitors of. I find it interesting to read about Jefferson. I have a library back here like full of books, some of them that I just bought from the Monticello gift shop, like another biography of Jefferson, and a book that's very glossy that has like pictures of the inside of Monticello in it. I think that what's fascinating to me about Jefferson is the fact that we're still living inside of the experiment that he and his generation envisioned. And for better and worse, okay, like we are living inside this very complicated legacy, this flawed vision that he had, where there are very, very good components to it, a lot of promise to it, but where it's expansionist, imperialist, it excludes people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, it excludes women. And so we're working towards this like this vision that he had, but we're trying to like work through all of the limitations of that same vision. So that's why I'm interested in him, not really for his own sake, but for what he represents.
Yes. Oh, that's a really good answer to that. Have you read Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed?
That's right. Okay. Yeah, I did. And I actually just gave my students that chapter where he goes to Monticello. Yeah. So Clint Smith's book, everybody, is a great book of essays where the writer and poet Clint Smith goes to 8 sites
Mhm.
that have to do with enslavement and racism in America, and Monticello is one of them. It's a great, great book.
I had read that right before I read White Blood, and I felt so much more informed to understand where I was. Um, yeah. Okay, so let me get to the next question. Let's see. Okay, so let's see. Libby Falk Jones would like to know, please talk about your use of traditional and experimental forms like the villanelle and the erasure. What do those forms enable you to do? At what point in the composing process do you decide to use a traditional form?
Mhm. You know, as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, I was an English major and I also minored in Italian. And so I learned a lot about traditional forms. I read a lot of sonnets, Italian sonnets and English sonnets. Villanelles were part of that. And I studied them as part of my literary work. There's something really resonant for me about the musicality of those received forms. We call them received forms or fixed forms. Um, a lot of them, I think, have roots in music or in song. The sonnet, the sonnet does, the villanelle, I learned was kind of a medieval song form. And so I really like that. I like repetition and incantation from a musical standpoint. But because I'm writing in English and not in some of these Romance languages where the poems these forms originated, I don't in English we don't have as easy access to the rhymes
Right.
that our continental predecessors did, and so already a villanelle in English is going to be really different, or a sonnet in English is going to feel and just be really different in American English than it would be in a European language. And this has been the case for a really long time, like since those forms came into English, and certainly since American poets have been working with them. So anything that I do that's in a traditional form is more like in dialogue with that traditional form. And it's there are ways that I can follow the script of that form. The villanelle is great because it allows you to repeat lines, and therefore you have the opportunity to introduce an idea and then elaborate the idea or work against the idea the next time that you repeat it. So that's why I like that form in particular. The form of the erasure, like I said, it allows me to work with some conceptual frameworks or conceptual ideas about speech and silence, especially when it comes to the historical record. But what's great about poetry is that it's a very capacious modality, and you can apply any number of forms to the subjects that you're writing about.
Yes, the villanelle is one I enjoy because I'm terrible with meter, and villanelle lets me write in form and not really have to worry about that as much.
Yep.
Okay, let me get to my next question. Let's see. Okay, Marissa wants to know. Okay, let's see. She said that was beautiful. How long did it take you to produce this collection? That was one of my questions too. If you could divvy the process up within the collection, how much was research-based and how much was personal reflection, reaction-based?
Those are really good questions and also kind of hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think I first got the idea to write a project like this in 2015, when my grandmother, the one who had family that was from Louisa, when she passed away, she was my last grandparent who had been alive. So I knew that, I was now in this different stage of life where you don't have your grandparents near you anymore. And so I was like, at first I thought I should write a book that was about her and about her really interesting life journey. I thought that's what it would be about. But then, and I started working on the Louisa poems, but then the violence in Charlottesville in 2017 happened, right when I was working on that project. And it was like I had had a research fellowship in Charlottesville. I had been in Charlottesville just 3 days before. I had passed through Charlottesville 3 days before the violence happened. And so it was really shocking to see those images and to look at the grounds, the campus where I had graduated, and see all of that violence that was occurring in a place where I had lived and where I had really loved to be. So then I was like, this book has to be about more than just one aspect of my ancestry. I also need to think about my own relationship to Virginia and to the university. So that's kind of when I started writing that sonnet sequence. And so each component came together as the years went by, and I was probably finished with the book sometime around mid 2019, which sounds like a really long time.
For somebody who's still like working on a second book, no, that's it's very reassuring to hear that there are experiences and threads, and again, that things happen in time and in the time that they should be or need to be happening, and then those poems show up. That's very reassuring to thinking about putting a collection together. Okay, looks like we have 2 more questions. Let's see. Okay, Trish wants to know, she says, you talked about research. Were you drawn to do the research because a poem called you, or did the poem arise from the research? So you've talked a little bit about this already, but were there some poems that came out of doing, like you were already in the research and then the poems came out of that, or are they all sort of driven by experience and memory and connection from the beginning?
I mean, a little bit of both. The poems that had to do with the Negro records in Louisa were very much from the research process. I mean, I went to the Library of Virginia, got myself a library card for that library. I got to sit in the special relic room or reading room. They brought the file to me. That's how, you request things in special collections. And then I was there for like a whole day, just like reading the documents. And I was really thought that I was there for genealogical reasons. I was trying to find my own ancestors' names on some of these records, but I did not really find them. But I was getting a sense of what this county was like for this period of time. And I was also kind of paying attention to the process of looking at these records and how I felt seeing, a potential like problem come up, right? Where it's like in the 1780s, the General Assembly of Virginia made it possible for an individual planter or slave owner to do a private manumission, right? So they would write out an affidavit, a certificate of manumission, and they would say like, I'm choosing to manumit these people from my estate or from my property. And then they would file that at the courthouse. But, in looking at that research or those documents, I saw a case where somebody was doing that. They were manumitting a whole list of people, but then they said some of these slaves are disputed, and I don't really know if I own them or not. Like shrug, basically, like I'm and basically saying I know that I can only free the ones that I truly own. I'm going to name all of them here, but I know that some of them there's some disputes about who owns them or whatever. And then you don't hear what happened. There's nothing else in the record. It just goes on to the next certificate. And so that felt so specific to me that I wanted to be able to write about that experience.
Yeah, I appreciate how much today we have had talk about libraries and librarians and the resource that is to our communities. We have one more question. It comes from Elaine. She said, have you inspired others to write of their DNA results? I know my percentages and feel inspired to write about them, with all credit to you for your wonderful poems.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm not aware of anybody else who has written about their DNA results in this particular way, but I'm happy that that could potentially be an inspiration, and that would be really cool if you tried to write some poems about that.
Yes, I don't know. The erasures really made me think about all sorts of texts that we come into contact with, and hearing that they were all the same section, like that blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, because I imagined like the artistry needed to do an erasure at all, because I really want to do this and I haven't quite figured it out. But to know that you found and created so many poems out of the same text is just like the galaxy opens up and you're like, oh my gosh, this is incredible.
It became really fun after a while. I felt like I really knew each paragraph really well. And each time I did it, I was getting better and better at erasing that paragraph, you know?
Yeah, just that you can see that much is amazing. Thank you so much. I hope that you can hear the virtual applause that is happening around you for your reading and for taking the time to answer our questions. So if you all could just, in the virtual sphere, give another round of thanks for this master poet. Thank you for being with us as our Kentucky State Poetry Society keynote this year. It's a gift to have this time with you. We thank you all for attending this session. Please do go to the book fair and purchase your copy of Kiki Petrosino's award-winning, multi-award-winning White Blood, a Lyric of Virginia, which was published by Saraband Books. Sarah's going to put the link to Saraband in the chat. Saraband is close to my heart. They've published Kiki's other books. They have a great lineup of books for you to look at. So please do go visit Saraband. We appreciate them being one of our conference sponsors. You can also find books by the other conference poets in our book fair. Please do support them. It has been a rough year for anyone in the arts, so they would appreciate you buying a book. And Sarah will put the link to the book fair in the chat too. We'd also like to thank our conference sponsors who help make the conference and this keynote possible. So thanks goes to Bluegrass Writer Studio at Eastern Kentucky University, Broadstone Books, Saraband Books, University Press of Kentucky, University of Kentucky's MFA program, the University of Louisville Creative Writing Program, Spalding University School of Creative and Professional Writing, Western Kentucky University's MFA program, and Workhorse Writers. Then everyone, please remember to sign up for tomorrow's open mic. It will be the final event of the day, and Sarah has put the link in the chat for that. And don't forget your entry into the KSPS Weekend Poetry Contest. That prompt was created by Danny Quintos, and it is about ghosts and witches and connects to Crystal Wilkinson's Perfect Black. So please get your entry in for that. It is due by noon tomorrow. At the end of the conference, we would ask that you would fill out the feedback form. You would have a chance to win a year's free membership to KSPS. Sarah's put the link in the chat for that. And tomorrow morning, we will have Savannah Sippel's generative workshop, Word Work, which will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So we welcome you to come back for that generative workshop for the second day. Kiki, thank you so much. This was so wonderful. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
You all have a good night.